She's pregnant. The sentence didn't just land. It shattered the air inside the Whitmore penthouse, a place where silence usually meant control, not shock. And for the first time in decades, Richard Whitmore, billionaire, empire builder, a man who owned more square footage than most people could imagine, forgot how to breathe. The city stretched beneath them in a glittering grid of lights, 1,200 feet below, but up here, everything felt suspended, as if even gravity was waiting to see what would happen. Next, Alexander Whitmore stood at the far end of the polished glass table, his jaw tight, his suit perfectly tailored but suddenly meaningless, because across from him, the board, men and women who traded in numbers larger than entire towns, were no longer looking at quarterly projections. They were looking at him like he had just set fire to the legacy they had spent decades building. "Say that again," Richard said quietly, his voice controlled, precise, the kind of tone that had ended careers, without ever needing to be raised. And Alex didn't hesitate, didn't soften it, didn't dress it up in language that might make it easier to swallow. "Emily is pregnant," he said, and her name, Emily Carter, hung in the room like something fragile and forbidden, something that didn't belong among marble floors imported from Italy and chandeliers that cost more than a suburban home. A faint scent of aged whiskey and polished wood lingered in the air, the signature of wealth that never had to announce itself. And yet somehow, that scent now felt sharp, almost suffocating, as if the room itself rejected the truth it had just been forced to hold. A woman at the table shifted uncomfortably, her diamond bracelet catching the light, while another man cleared his throat, pretending to glance at his tablet. But no one spoke, because everyone knew exactly who Emily Carter was, the maid's daughter. The girl who moved through this very space like a shadow, quiet, invisible, the kind of presence people forgot the moment they turned away. Richard finally stood, slow and deliberate, his reflection stretching across the glass wall behind him, merging with the skyline like he owned that too. And when he spoke again, his words were calm, but there was something colder beneath them, something final. "That girl," he said, each syllable measured, "was never meant to exist in our world." And Alex felt it then. Not anger, not yet, but the weight of a line being drawn, a boundary carved in stone long before he was born, a rule that said people like Emily could serve, could clean, could disappear, but they could never belong. Somewhere far from this tower of steel and glass, Emily was already gone, carrying more than just a secret, carrying a truth buried deep enough to shake the very foundation of Whitmore Industries. And as the silence stretched tighter, thinner, ready to snap, Alex made a decision that no one in that room could predict, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about legacy or power or the empire that had his last name carved into it. He was thinking about her. The room did not move, but something inside it shifted, subtle and irreversible, like a crack forming beneath polished marble, and Richard Whitmore's gaze hardened as he stepped closer to the table, his reflection splitting across the glass surface beneath him. "You will end this," he said, not raising his voice, not needing to, because authority like his did not rely on volume. It relied on certainty, and for decades, that certainty had never been questioned. Alex did not sit, did not lower. His eyes did not retreat into the version of himself that had always complied. Instead, he stood there, steady, his heartbeat loud in his chest, but his voice controlled. "I am not ending anything," he replied, and the words felt foreign even to him, like stepping on a ground he had never been allowed to touch. A quiet murmur rippled through the boardroom, the kind of discomfort that wealthy people disguised behind polite silence. Because this was not how the story was supposed to go, not in a family where decisions were inherited like assets and obedience was expected like loyalty. Outside, the Manhattan skyline flickered in gold and white, each light representing lives untouched by the storm building in this room. But inside, the air had grown colder, sharper, the scent of expensive cologne and aged wood no longer comforting, but suffocating. "You are not thinking clearly," Richard continued, his tone measured, as if explaining something obvious to a child. "That girl is not part of this family, and she never will be." And there it was again, that word, girl, stripped of a name, stripped of identity, reduced to something disposable, something temporary, something that could be erased without consequence. Alex felt the memory hit him then, uninvited but vivid. Emily standing in the hallway just weeks ago, sunlight catching in her hair as she held a stack of freshly folded linens, her movements quiet, careful, as if she had spent her entire life learning how not to take up space. And yet when she looked at him, really looked at him, there was nothing small about her, nothing invisible. There was clarity, intelligence, something steady that did not bend just because the world told it to. She has a name, Alex said, more firmly now, and that single sentence carried more defiance than anything he had ever spoken in this room. And for a moment, just a moment, Richard's expression faltered, not with anger, but with something closer to disbelief, as if he were witnessing a language he no longer understood. A man at the far end of the table shifted in his chair, adjusting his cufflinks, avoiding eye contact, while another woman pressed her lips together, her perfectly composed demeanor cracking at the edges, because everyone in that room could feel it, the shift, the fracture in a system that had always been airtight. Names do not change reality, Richard said finally, his voice returning to its calm, controlled cadence. What you are doing will destroy everything this family has built. And the word everything echoed, heavy, loaded with decades of ambition, sacrifice, and power. But Alex no longer saw it the same way, because somewhere beyond these walls, beyond the reach of contracts and influence, Emily was carrying something far more fragile and far more powerful than any empire. And for the first time in his life, Alex realized that everything his father feared losing might not be worth protecting at all. The silence did not end. When his words did, it stretched, thin and fragile, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for someone to restore the order that had just been broken. But no one moved, not even Richard Whitmore, who stood there with the stillness of a man calculating outcomes faster than anyone else in the room could understand. And when he finally spoke again, his voice had changed, not louder, not harsher, but colder, stripped of anything resembling patience. "Do you know where she is?" he asked. And it was not a question meant to gather information. It was a question meant to measure loyalty. Alex did not answer immediately, because the truth was heavier than anything he had said so far. And in that hesitation, the entire room seemed to lean forward without moving, because they all understood what was really being asked, not about Emily's location, but about where Alex himself stood. "No," he said at last, and the words settled into the air with a quiet finality, because for the first time, the heir to Whitmore Industries did not have control, did not have access, did not have certainty, and that absence of control was something his father had never taught him how to handle. A faint smile touched Richard's lips, but it did not reach his eyes. "Then let me make something clear," he said, stepping closer, his reflection now overlapping Alex's in the glass wall behind them. Two versions of the same legacy, standing on opposite sides of an invisible line. If she believes she can walk away with anything connected to this family, she is mistaken. And the word anything was not about money, not about status. It was about influence, about power, about the invisible web that could reach places Emily Carter could never even see. Alex felt it then, not fear, but understanding. A realization that whatever Emily had taken with her was already threatening something far larger than a personal scandal, because his father did not speak like this unless something was at risk. His mind flickered back, not to their last conversation, but to something smaller, quieter. Emily standing in the service corridor late at night, a tablet in her hands, her brow slightly furrowed as she studied something she was not supposed to see. And when she noticed him, she had closed it too quickly, offering a soft explanation that did not quite match the tension in her eyes. And he had let it go then, because he trusted her, because he never imagined that the girl who had been taught to disappear would be the one thing his world could not ignore. "She is not what you think," Alex said, and this time his voice carried something new, not just defiance, but certainty. And that certainty was what made Richard pause, just for a fraction of a second, because certainty was dangerous when it came from someone who had finally stopped following orders. A man near the window shifted, glancing between them, as if trying to read a language written beneath the surface, because now it was no longer just about a relationship. It was about something hidden, something unspoken, something that had already begun to unravel the foundation beneath their feet. "Then what is she?" Richard asked. And for the first time, there was no immediate answer, because somewhere across the city, in a place far removed from glass towers and polished floors, Emily Carter was no longer invisible, and whatever she carried with her was about to make sure no one would ever look past her again. The question did not fade when it was asked. It lingered, pressing against the glass walls, echoing between steel and silence, and Alex felt the weight of it settle into his chest, because for the first time, the truth was no longer something he could protect by staying quiet. It was something that had already begun to move without him. Far from the penthouse, beyond the reach of Whitmore's security and the invisible network of influence that kept their world contained, Emily Carter sat alone in a small, dimly lit apartment that smelled faintly of old coffee and rain-soaked pavement, her hands resting over a worn canvas bag that held more than just her belongings. It held the fragile edge of something dangerous, something she had never intended to find. The city outside her window was loud, restless, alive in a way that the penthouse never was, sirens in the distance, voices drifting up from the street. A reminder that life continued without permission, without hierarchy, without the rules she had spent her entire life trying to follow. She closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the exact second everything had changed, not the moment Alex said her name like it mattered, not the moment she realized she was carrying his child, but the moment she saw it. A file left open on a screen that was never meant for her. Numbers that did not add up, transactions hidden beneath layers of approvals. A pattern so precise it could not be accidental, and once she saw it, she could not unsee it. Back in the penthouse, Richard Whitmore watched his son with a gaze that had dismantled competitors twice his size. But this time there was something different, something unsettled beneath the surface, because the certainty he relied on was beginning to fracture, not from outside forces, but from within his own bloodline. "You are protecting something," he said slowly, his voice quieter now, but far more dangerous, because it was no longer an accusation. It was a conclusion, and Alex did not deny it, because denial would have been easier, safer, something his father could control, but truth had a way of slipping through control like light through glass. She did not run away, Alex said, each word deliberate, grounded. She left for a reason, and the room shifted again, not visibly, but in the subtle tension of people realizing that the story they had already judged might not be the one unfolding. A woman near the center of the table leaned back slightly, her expression tightening, while another executive exchanged a glance with his colleague, silent communication passing between them, because they understood what Richard understood. If Emily Carter had seen something, if she had taken something, then this was no longer about family, it was about exposure. In the quiet of her apartment, Emily reached into the bag and pulled out the small device. Its screen faintly cracked, its contents far more valuable than anything she had ever owned. And for a moment, her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the realization that she was standing at the edge of a world that had never intended for her to see its foundation. She had spent years learning how to be invisible, how to move through rooms without being noticed, how to exist without leaving a mark. But now invisibility was no longer protection. It was a risk, because what she carried had the power to force an entire empire into the light. Back above the city, in a room built on certainty, Alex Whitmore stood alone against generations of expectation. And for the first time, the future of Whitmore Industries was not being decided by contracts or board votes. It was being shaped by a girl they had all once overlooked, and no one in that room was ready for what her next move would reveal. The room did not erupt into chaos. It tightened instead, like a knot being pulled slowly, deliberately, and Richard Whitmore's eyes narrowed just enough to betray what he rarely allowed anyone to see. Concern, not for his son, not for reputation, but for control slipping through his fingers in ways he could not immediately measure. "What reason?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost measured to sound reasonable. But beneath it was calculation, the kind that built empires and erased problems before they could take shape, and Alex understood that tone better than anyone. It was the voice his father used when something had already become a threat. "She saw something," Alex said, and this time he did not soften it, did not protect the truth with careful phrasing, because the moment for that had passed the second Emily walked away, something she was not supposed to see. And those words did more than answer a question. They shifted the entire balance of the room, because suddenly, this was not about a relationship, not about class, not even about a child. It was about exposure. Across the table, a man in a dark suit straightened, his fingers tightening around a sleek silver pen, while another executive's confident posture subtly collapsed into stillness, because they all knew how this worked. Secrets at this level were not accidents. They were systems, carefully maintained, carefully hidden. And if someone outside that system had touched even a fragment of it, the consequences could stretch far beyond one family. Miles away, in the small apartment where the hum of an old refrigerator filled the silence, Emily Carter stared at the screen in front of her, her reflection faint in the cracked glass. Her eyes no longer the eyes of someone trying to disappear, but of someone who had finally seen too much to ever look away again. Lines of data scrolled beneath her fingertips, transactions routed through shell accounts, approvals signed by names that carried weight in rooms like the one Alex stood in now, patterns that repeated too cleanly to be coincidence. And at the center of it all, a single thread that led back to Whitmore Industries. She remembered the moment she realized what it meant, how her breath caught not from fear, but from the sudden clarity that the world she had spent years quietly moving through was not just divided by wealth, but built on things no one was meant to question. And now she was holding proof that those foundations were not as untouchable as they seemed. Back in the penthouse, Richard turned slightly, his gaze shifting not just to Alex, but to the people seated around him, reading them, measuring them, calculating what they knew, what they suspected, and more importantly, what they might do if this situation was not contained, because power was not just about control, it was about anticipation. If she has taken anything, he said slowly, his voice returning to that calm, commanding tone that had guided billion-dollar decisions, then this is no longer a private matter. And no one in the room argued, no one needed to, because they understood the language beneath the words. This had escalated beyond family, beyond personal boundaries, into something far more dangerous, something that could not be allowed to surface. Alex felt the shift like a physical force, the moment his father stopped seeing Emily as a problem and started seeing her as a risk, and that difference was everything, because problems could be dismissed, but risks were dealt with systematically, efficiently, and without hesitation. In the quiet of her apartment, Emily closed the device, her hands steady now, her decision forming not out of impulse, but out of something deeper, something shaped by years of watching, listening, understanding a world that had never intended to include her. And for the first time, she was not thinking about staying hidden. She was thinking about what would happen if she stepped into the light, because what she carried was no longer just a secret. It was leverage, it was truth, and somewhere high above the city, in a room built on silence and power, that truth was already beginning to change everything. Find her, Richard Whitmore said, and this time the command did not echo. It settled, heavy and absolute, as if the decision had already been executed the moment he spoke it. And around the table, subtle movements followed. A phone turned face down, a glance exchanged, a silent network awakening without needing further instruction, because this was how power operated at this level, not with noise, but with precision. Alex felt it immediately, not the action itself, but the shift in intention. The moment his father stopped waiting and started moving, and something inside him tightened, because he knew exactly what that meant. Not chaos, not confrontation, but something far more controlled, something that would close in quietly until there was nowhere left to stand. No, Alex said, and the word cut through the room sharper than before, not louder, but firmer, grounded in something that no longer wavered, and for the first time, the room did react, not with voices, but with stillness. The kind that came when a rule was broken so completely it could not be ignored. Richard turned his head slightly, studying his son with a gaze that no longer measured obedience, but resistance, and that was new, unfamiliar, dangerous in a way even wealth could not easily contain. You are not in a position to refuse, he replied, calm as ever. But the calm had shifted, it no longer reassured, it warned. Alex stepped forward, just enough to break the symmetry of the room, just enough to stand where he had never stood before. Then I am no longer in a position to agree, he said, and the sentence did not sound like rebellion. It sounded like something else entirely, something irreversible. Miles away, Emily Carter stood at the narrow window of her apartment, the city stretching wide and indifferent beyond her, her reflection faint against the glass. And for a moment, she looked like she always had, quiet, small, easy to overlook. But the difference was not in how she appeared, it was in what she now understood, because once you see the structure behind something, the hidden lines, the patterns no one talks about, you cannot return to not knowing. She picked up her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen, not uncertain, but deliberate, because this next step was not about fear, it was about timing, and she had learned, quietly, carefully, that timing was everything in a world that pretended control was permanent. Back in the penthouse, Richard exhaled slowly, not frustrated, not yet, but recalibrating, adjusting to a reality where his son was no longer predictable. And that unpredictability was something he had spent a lifetime eliminating from every system he built. You are protecting someone who cannot protect you, he said, his voice softer now, almost reflective, as if offering a final chance to return to alignment. But Alex did not look away, did not reconsider, because somewhere beneath the layers of expectation and legacy, something simpler had taken hold, something his father could not calculate. She does not need to protect me, Alex answered. She is protecting the truth. And the word truth landed differently than everything else. It did not threaten, it revealed, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered across Richard's face, not fear, but recognition, because truth was not something you controlled, it was something you contained, or it spread. In the quiet of her apartment, Emily pressed the screen, initiating something small on the surface, a message, a transfer, a signal that would not be traced easily, but would be felt. And as she lowered the phone, her hands no longer trembled, because she had already crossed the line between invisible and undeniable, and somewhere high above the city, in a room where control had always been absolute, the first crack had just become impossible to ignore. The message did not explode across the world, it slipped into it. Quietly, almost politely, like a whisper that knew exactly where to land. And somewhere deep within the encrypted systems of Whitmore Industries, a notification blinked to life, unnoticed at first, then hesitated over, then opened, and in that single moment, the balance began to tilt. In the penthouse, a subtle vibration broke the stillness, not loud enough to command attention, but enough to interrupt the fragile control that Richard Whitmore had been rebuilding word by word. And one of the executives glanced down at his device, his expression shifting ever so slightly, a flicker of something he quickly tried to hide, but not quickly enough. Alex saw it. The change, the hesitation, the moment where certainty gave way to doubt, and he understood immediately that whatever Emily had just done, it had reached further than either of them had expected. "What is it?" Richard asked, not turning his head, not needing to, because he had spent a lifetime reading rooms without looking at them. And the man hesitated, just for a second too long, before answering. "It is nothing significant." But the words lacked conviction, and in a room built on precision, that was enough to make them dangerous. Richard slowly shifted his gaze, and now the silence returned, heavier, more deliberate, because something unseen had just entered the equation, something no one had planned for. Miles away, Emily Carter stood still, her phone now dark in her hand, her breathing steady, her eyes fixed not on the city outside, but on the reflection staring back at her. And for the first time, she did not look like someone trying to disappear. She looked like someone who had made a decision she could not undo, because what she had sent was not everything. Not yet. It was just enough, just a fragment, a carefully chosen piece of truth designed to surface without revealing the full weight behind it. She had learned that lesson well, not from books or mentors, but from watching, from years of listening, to conversations not meant for her, from understanding that power did not reveal itself all at once, it unfolded in layers, and now she was doing the same. Back in the penthouse, Richard extended his hand, a small gesture, but one that carried authority no one questioned, and the device was passed to him without resistance, because whatever had just appeared on that screen had already begun to ripple through the room. And when his eyes moved across it, slowly, carefully, something shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but in the smallest tightening of his jaw. in the way his fingers paused instead of continuing to scroll. Because the numbers did not lie, the pattern was there, subtle but undeniable, a fracture hidden beneath years of perfect reports and polished presentations. Alex watched him, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, because this was no longer about convincing anyone. The truth had already begun to speak for itself, and it did not need his voice. "Where did this come from?" Richard asked. And this time the question was not rhetorical, it was precise, targeted. And for the first time since the conversation began, there was something beneath it that had not been there before. Not fear, but uncertainty, and uncertainty was something Richard Whitmore did not tolerate. Alex did not answer, because he did not need to, because somewhere across the city, Emily Carter had already stepped into a role no one had ever allowed her to hold. Not invisible, not dismissed, but central, essential. And as the silence tightened once more around the table, it became clear to everyone present that this was no longer a situation that could be contained with quiet decisions and controlled narratives. Because the moment the truth begins to surface, even in fragments, it stops belonging to those who once controlled it. And now, for the first time, Whitmore Industries was no longer the one holding all the power. "Run a full internal audit," Richard Whitmore said. And this time there was no hesitation in the room, no attempt to soften the moment, because the illusion had already cracked and everyone could feel it spreading beneath their feet. The executives moved quickly now, not out of panic, but out of instinct, because this was the language they understood: contain, verify, control, and yet beneath that surface of order, something far less stable was beginning to take shape: doubt. Alex remained still, watching it unfold, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet certainty that what had started could no longer be reversed, because truth, once revealed, even in fragments, did not return to silence. Across the city, Emily Carter sat at the small wooden table by the window, the dim light casting long shadows across the worn surface, her laptop open, the screen reflecting in her eyes as lines of data connected in ways she had not fully understood before, but now saw with startling clarity. The fragment she had released was already doing what it was meant to do, not exposing everything, but forcing attention, forcing questions, forcing a system built on unquestioned authority to look at itself. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself, because this was the part no one prepares you for, not the discovery, not the decision, but the moment after, when everything begins to move and you can no longer control how far it goes. Back in the penthouse, the calm had shifted into something sharper, more urgent, voices still low, controlled, but now layered with something they could not hide: concern. "This could be misinterpreted," one executive said carefully, choosing each word as if it might break under the wrong pressure, while another added, "We need to isolate the source before assumptions spread." But even as they spoke, their confidence was thinner, their certainty less absolute, because they all saw the same thing. Richard saw the pattern was real, subtle, but consistent, and patterns like that did not appear by accident. Richard's gaze moved slowly across the screen again, not searching, but confirming, aligning what he was seeing with what he already knew. And in that moment, something deeper surfaced: not fear, not yet, but recognition, the kind that comes when a hidden structure begins to reveal itself from the inside. "This does not leave this room," he said finally, his voice low but decisive, and the words carried weight. But for the first time, they did not carry certainty, because everyone in that room understood something had already left, something had already crossed the boundary he was trying to reinforce. Alex stepped closer to the table, his reflection merging with the city lights behind him, and for the first time, he did not feel like someone standing inside his father's world. He felt like someone standing outside of it, looking in, seeing the flaws that had always been there, but were never acknowledged. "It is already out," he said, and the sentence did not challenge, it revealed, and as it settled into the room, it changed everything, because control depended on timing, and they were already too late. Miles away, Emily closed her laptop slowly, her hands no longer trembling, her breathing calm, because she understood now that this was not about exposing everything at once. It was about shifting balance, about forcing a system to respond instead of dictate, and for the first time in her life, She was no longer reacting to a world that overlooked her. She was shaping it. The city outside continued without pause. Cars moving, lights flickering, lives unfolding, unaware that somewhere above them, an empire was beginning to question itself, and somewhere within it, a girl who was once invisible had become the one thing no one could ignore. And as the silence in the penthouse deepened once more, it was no longer the silence of control. It was the silence before something far bigger than any one person could contain. "Then we control what comes next," Richard Whitmore said, and the sentence did not sound like a reaction. It sounded like a strategy already forming, already unfolding beneath the surface, because control, to him, was never about stopping something. It was about reshaping it before anyone else understood what it was. The executives straightened almost instinctively, their discomfort folding back into discipline. Because this was familiar territory again, crisis turned into opportunity. Uncertainty turned into narrative, and yet the difference now was subtle but undeniable. They were responding, not leading. Alex watched it happen in real time. The shift from shock to calculation, from exposure to containment, and he realized that this was the real engine behind everything his family had built, not just wealth, but the ability to redefine truth before it settled. "We issue a statement," one of the executives suggested, his voice steady but careful. "Frame this as a misinterpretation, a routine anomaly under review." And another added, "We can get ahead of it before it escalates." And the words flowed smoothly, practiced, refined, because they had done this before. Not this exact situation, but the pattern was the same. Something surfaces, something threatens, and they adjust the story until it no longer threatens at all. Richard nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if these ideas were expected, predictable, stepping stones towards something more precise. "Not yet," he said, and the room stilled again, because timing was everything, and he would not move until he understood exactly how far this had spread. Miles away, Emily Carter sat in the quiet hum of her apartment, her phone lighting up again, not with calls, not with messages from people she knew, but with something else, responses, signals, subtle confirmations that what she had released had reached beyond a single inbox, beyond a single system, and was beginning to ripple outward, not loudly, not publicly, but quietly, within networks that paid attention to patterns like the one she had exposed. She did not smile. She did not celebrate, because this was not victory. This was escalation, and she understood that better than anyone, because she had spent years watching how quickly things could shift once power felt threatened. She stood and walked slowly to the window, the city stretching out before her, vast and indifferent, but now she saw it differently, not as something distant and unreachable, but as something connected, layered, full of unseen systems that could be touched, influenced, changed. Back in the penthouse, Richard turned to Alex fully now, no longer dividing his attention, because the room had become secondary, the real variable standing in front of him. "If she believes this will protect her, she is mistaken," he said, and the words were calm, but beneath them was something sharper, something more personal, because this was no longer just about the company. It was about a challenge to the structure he had spent his life building. Alex did not step back, did not break eye contact, because something inside him had already shifted beyond fear, beyond hesitation, into something steadier, something that did not rely on approval. "She is not trying to protect herself," he said. "She is making sure the truth cannot be buried again." And the word again hung there, subtle, but enough, because it implied history, repetition, something deeper than a single incident. For a moment, no one spoke, not because they did not have words, but because they understood what was unfolding. This was no longer a situation to manage quietly. It was a fracture that had already begun to spread, and somewhere between the silence and the city lights, the balance of power was shifting in a way none of them could fully control, because for the first time, the story was no longer theirs to write. "Then she comes back," Alex said, and the words did not rise. They settled, firm and inevitable, cutting through every strategy forming in the room, because for the first time, the solution was not something Richard Whitmore could engineer from behind a table. It required something he had spent a lifetime avoiding: acknowledgement. The executives exchanged glances, subtle, uncertain, Because this was not how these situations were handled. Problems were contained, narratives were rewritten, but inviting the source of disruption back into the center of power was not control, it was risk. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, studying his son not as an extension of himself, but as an opposing force that had finally taken shape. "You think she will walk back into this room?" he said, his voice calm but edged with disbelief. "After what she has done?" And Alex did not hesitate, because he understood something now that no one else in that room fully grasped. "She did not do this to destroy you," he replied. "She did it because no one here would ever stop otherwise." And the sentence landed with a different kind of weight, not accusation, but truth that had been avoided for too long. Miles away, Emily Carter stood in the soft glow of a streetlight outside her building, the cool air brushing against her skin as the city moved around her without pause. Her phone silent now, the signal she had sent already in motion, already beyond her reach, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel it. Not fear, not regret, but the quiet realization that she had crossed a boundary no one had ever expected her to reach. A car passed slowly, its headlights sweeping across her face, illuminating the steadiness in her expression. Because she was no longer deciding whether to act. She had already acted, and now the world would respond. Back in the penthouse, Richard turned away from the table, walking slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city stretching endlessly beneath him. A kingdom of light and motion that had always reflected his control, but tonight, it felt different, not smaller, but less certain, as if something within it had shifted beyond his influence. "You are asking me to trust someone who has already breached that trust," he said without turning, his voice quieter now, not weaker, but more measured, because this was no longer a simple equation of power and obedience. It was something more complex, something that required him to consider a variable he had always dismissed. Alex stepped forward, his reflection aligning with his father's in the glass, not behind, not beneath, but beside, and that alone changed the dynamic more than any words could. "You never gave her trust to begin with," he said, and the sentence did not challenge, it revealed, and in that revelation, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, because it exposed the foundation beneath everything they had built. Not trust, not fairness, but control disguised as order. Inside the quiet of her thoughts, Emily made her decision, not impulsively, not emotionally, but with the same clarity that had guided her every step since she first saw the truth hidden in plain sight. And she turned, walking back toward the building, not to hide, not to disappear, but to prepare, because if she stepped forward now, it would not be as someone asking to be seen. It would be as someone who could no longer be ignored. In the penthouse, the silence returned once more, but it was no longer the silence of dominance. It was the silence of realization, the kind that comes when the future you have controlled for decades is no longer entirely yours to shape. And as Richard Whitmore stood looking out over a city he believed he understood, he knew something had changed, not outside, but within, and the next move would not belong to him alone. The elevator doors opened with a quiet precision that matched the building itself, smooth, controlled, almost indifferent. But the moment Emily Carter stepped inside the Whitmore Tower again, everything felt different, not because the marble floors had changed or the air no longer carried the faint scent of polished wood and expensive cologne, but because she had. The lobby stretched wide and immaculate, every surface reflecting a world built on perfection. But for the first time, she did not lower her gaze, did not adjust her steps to become invisible. She walked forward, steady, composed, her presence no longer asking for permission. Security noticed her immediately, not with recognition, but with uncertainty, because something about her did not match the role they had once assigned her, and hesitation, even for a second, was enough, because by the time they decided to approach, she had already crossed the space that used to feel impossible. Upstairs, the boardroom doors remained closed, but the silence inside had shifted into something heavier, something waiting, and when the soft chime of the elevator echoed down the hall, it cut through the tension like a signal no one could ignore. Alex turned first, not out of instinct, but because something in him already knew, and when the doors opened at the far end of the corridor, he did not move. He simply watched as Emily stepped out, her figure framed by the cold light of the hallway, her expression calm, unreadable, but unwavering. The room behind him did not speak, did not react immediately, because the sight of her there did not fit into any of the outcomes they had prepared for, and for a moment, the system they relied on had no response. Richard Whitmore remained by the window, his reflection still cast against the city, but his eyes shifted just enough to register her presence. And in that subtle movement, everything changed, because the variable he had tried to control had just walked back into his world on her own terms. Emily moved forward, each step quiet but deliberate, the sound of her heels against the polished floor echoing softly, not disruptive, but undeniable, and when she reached the threshold of the boardroom, she did not pause. She did not wait to be invited. She stepped inside. The air in the room felt different now, not just tense, but exposed, as if the truth that had been discussed in fragments had suddenly taken form, standing right in front of them. "You should not be here," one of the executives said, his voice controlled but strained, and Emily turned her gaze toward him briefly, not confrontational, not defensive, simply steady, before looking past him, toward the man who had built everything this room represented. Richard Whitmore did not speak immediately. He studied her, the way he studied numbers, patterns, risks. But there was something unfamiliar in his expression now, something he could not reduce to data or strategy. "You came back," he said finally, and the sentence held more than acknowledgement. It held the beginning of something he had not planned for. Emily met his gaze, and for the first time, the distance between their worlds felt smaller, not because she had risen to meet his, but because she was no longer standing beneath it. "I did not leave to hide," she said, her voice calm, clear, carrying across the room without effort. "I left because no one here was ready to see the truth." And the word truth settled into the space between them, no longer abstract, no longer distant, but present, undeniable, and for the first time, no one in that room could look away. The room did not erupt. It held, suspended in a tension that no one could quite break. Because Emily Carter was no longer an idea or a rumor or a problem discussed behind closed doors. She was standing there, calm, composed, and impossibly certain, and that certainty unsettled them more than any accusation ever could. Richard Whitmore stepped away from the window slowly, not rushed, not reactive, but deliberate, as if every movement still belonged to him, as if control had not shifted even for a moment. Yet something in his eyes had changed, something quieter, something that recognized this was no longer a situation he could simply reshape. "Then show it," he said, his voice measured, precise, the same tone he used when closing deals worth hundreds of millions, but this time it carried a different weight, because he was not negotiating, he was confronting. Emily did not hesitate. She did not glance at Alex, did not seek reassurance, because this was no longer about being believed. It was about being undeniable. And as she placed the small device onto the polished glass table, the sound was soft, almost insignificant, but it echoed through the room like a line being drawn. The executives leaned forward, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity, because whatever she had already released was only a fragment, and they all knew it. The screen lit up, casting a faint glow across their faces. Numbers, timestamps, transaction paths, layers of approvals that connected in a pattern too precise to dismiss. And as the data unfolded, it told a story none of them could rewrite. Not quickly enough, not completely enough. Alex watched them, not with triumph, not with anger, but with a quiet understanding, because this was the moment everything shifted from speculation to reality, from control to consequence. One of the executives cleared his throat, his voice lower now, less certain. This could still be contextual. But even he did not finish the sentence, because the evidence did not bend, it did not blur, it stood exactly as it was. Richard remained still, his gaze fixed on the screen, absorbing, calculating, but this time the calculation did not lead to immediate solutions, because the foundation itself had been touched, and foundations were not easily adjusted. Emily spoke again, her voice steady, not raised, not emotional, but grounded in something far stronger than either. "This is not one mistake," she said. "It is a system." And the word system carried through the room, settling into every corner, because it explained everything without needing to say more. The silence that followed was no longer tense. It was exposed, stripped of the illusion that had protected it for so long. And in that silence, something else began to form. Not panic, not collapse, but realization. Alex stepped closer, standing beside Emily now, not in front of her, not shielding her, but aligned with her, and that alignment said more than any argument ever could. Richard finally looked up, his gaze moving from the screen to Emily, then to his son, and for the first time, the dynamic had shifted completely. Not through force, not through rebellion, but through truth that could no longer be contained. "What do you want?" he asked, and the question was no longer about control. It was about consequence, about what came next when the narrative was no longer his to define. Emily did not answer immediately, because the answer was not simple, not small. It was something that would reshape everything this room represented. And as she met his gaze without hesitation, it became clear to everyone present that this was not the end of the story they had tried to control. It was the beginning of something they would have to face. Emily Carter did not rush her answer, because some truths were not meant to be spoken quickly. They were meant to be understood, and as she stood there in a room that had once reduced her to silence, her voice carried something entirely different now. Not defiance, not anger, but clarity. "I do not want anything," she said finally, and the simplicity of the sentence unsettled them more than any demand could have, because this was a world where everything had a price, everything had leverage. And yet she stood there without asking for either. The executives shifted slightly, uncertain, because without a transaction, without negotiation, they had no framework to respond, no structure to contain what was happening. Richard Whitmore remained still, his gaze fixed on her, searching for something beneath her words, some hidden angle, some calculation he could understand, but there was none, only a calm certainty that did not bend. "Then why come back?" he asked, and for the first time, the question was not about control or power. It was about understanding, something far less familiar to him. Emily's eyes did not waver as she answered, because the truth should not depend on who has the power to hide it. And the words settled into the room with a quiet permanence, because they were not directed at one person. They were directed at everything the room represented. Alex stood beside her, not speaking, not needing to, because the space between them said enough. A shared understanding that did not require explanation. The city lights outside flickered against the glass walls, casting reflections that blurred the boundaries between inside and outside, between the world they controlled and the one they had never truly seen. Richard exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that marked the end of one calculation and the beginning of another. But this time, the equation was different, because control was no longer absolute, and the variables were no longer predictable. "You realize what this means," he said, not as a warning, but as a statement, because even he understood that what had been revealed could not simply be undone. Emily nodded once, not out of agreement, but acknowledgement, because she had known that from the moment she chose to act. "Then it changes," she said, and the sentence was not dramatic, not forceful, but it carried something deeper, something inevitable, because change at this level did not arrive with noise. It arrived quietly, reshaping everything beneath it. The silence that followed was no longer tense. It was reflective, as if the room itself was adjusting to a new reality, one where power alone was not enough to define truth. Alex looked toward his father, not with challenge, not with defiance, but with something else entirely, something closer to respect, but not for authority, for the possibility of what came next. Richard Whitmore held that gaze for a moment, and in that moment, something shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to suggest that even the strongest structures could evolve when faced with something they could not control. Outside, the city continued as it always had, lights moving, lives unfolding, unaware that somewhere above, a quiet transformation had taken place, not through force, not through demand, but through the simple refusal to remain unseen. And in that stillness, one truth became clear, that dignity does not come from wealth or power. It comes from the courage to stand where you were never meant to stand and be seen.